Okay, everybody, welcome back. As I mentioned earlier, we have two distinguished proponents of diversity and clean energy joining us here on the stage for a fireside chat. And I'm going to introduce Maria briefly, who is then going to introduce Dr. Moniz. And Maria is the E.A. Griswold Professor of Geophysics and Vice President for Research at MIT. And she oversees a lot of labs, and including the MIT Energy Initiative. So we appreciate all her work. She's been a leader on the climate plan here at MIT and its implementation. There's a lot of other great stuff I could tell you, but without further delay, I will hand it over to Maria.
Great, thank you, Martha. Okay, so it is great to be here at this conference again. I want to thank MITI and the Stanford Precourt Institute for Energy and the DOE for their co-sponsorship of this fantastic event. So this is actually, it's one of my favorite science events to go to. And I've said in the past that anyone who's interested in fusion power could do well to study the thermodynamics of this event because it is net positive energy. Okay, this event generates much more energy than it expends, and so I always just get absolutely completely energized whenever I come.
You aren't a physicist, are you?
Yeah, these kind of things play well at MIT, Ernie, as you well know. Ladies, let me just say that we are not going to solve the transition to clean energy unless we can sign up all the reasonable guys we can find, okay, to help us out, okay? And we have first among equals here tonight. So I am delighted to welcome Ernest Moniz, 13th Secretary of Energy, served from 2013 to 2017.
Noon January 20th.
Noon January 20th of 2017, and then got out of Dodge, and fortunately came back here. Also served both as Associate Director for Science at OSTP and as Undersecretary of Energy under the Clinton administration. Has been a professor of physics at MIT, currently a co-lead of the Nuclear Threat Initiative now, back at MIT, also helping us out, and was the founding director of MITI here. And then, in addition to that, has just been, just with Melanie Kenderdine, founded this event. Okay, so thank you, Ernie, and we're just going to start off with the conversation. So we'll just see where this goes, and then the last 10 minutes or so, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So any of you who might have a question, a burning question that you might want to ask Ernie. Well, let's get right down to it. The president has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement. Syria has entered the Paris Agreement, so the U.S. is the only country on Earth who is not signed up for Paris right now. There are threats of cuts to clean energy research. There are, is the possible elimination of incentives for the development of clean energy solutions. And so, just to start off with an easy one, just let's get your take on the landscape right now. What are the challenges and what are the opportunities? And, we'll just go from there. Okay.
All right, well, thanks, Maria. And I should start off by saying how it is great to be back in this environment, not just MIT, but this C3E meeting. Actually, I will just say, as Maria said, I mean, the C3E started, I think most know, as part of the Clean Energy Ministerial, but then following a session in Abu Dhabi, where Melanie was one of the panelists, then basically came back and said, we got to push DOE a little bit and get this to become a real operation, a real important event. Really get a bunch of ambassadors out there to both celebrate women with accomplishment in the field, but even more important, through them help encourage a new generation of women who we certainly need in this field. So it was really terrific, and as I've got to say, it was one of the really high points in Mighty, I think, really to see this become such a success, and also last year to be out at the when I was still secretary, and we hosted the Clean Energy Ministerial in the Bay Area in 2016, to then have a meeting at Stanford, which had a tremendous international representation in the women's event. So it's been really great, and I should say with. Again, with all my DOE, I've seen a whole bunch of DOE former colleagues. At least I'm former. Some of them are not former here, but we mentioned Melanie, but also going back to the Clinton years, Mary Ann Sullivan, somewhere here, who was our general counsel. Carol, sitting here now, who is in the policy office. And then every offense intended. And then a new generation as well of younger women who we had in the department. Some of them, I mean, Kate, Sandy, Lindsay, Aurora, Anne Marie, all here. I probably have missed some. I apologize, but I just want to say that you were all a very important part of why, certainly for me, the last 4+ years minus 10 months were really a special time where I think we got a lot done. So it's great. Thank you all again for that teamwork. On your question, Maria, first let's start by saying I think it is actually important to say that the president did not take us out of the agreement. He announced the beginning of the process to take us out of the agreement. I think, as probably most of you know, we cannot actually leave the agreement until the day after the next presidential election in 2020. And I don't want to be Pollyannish, but let's just wait and see whether or not we actually leave the agreement. As I think the public opinion more and more keeps moving in the right direction, et cetera. And I wouldn't be surprised if we find some way of sustaining the agreement. In fact, it's worth, I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place, but as an observation, which is not said often enough in my view, we forget that addressing climate, addressing the anthropogenic causes of climate, is actually the law of the United States of America. In 1992, after Rio, the treaty was signed by President Bush and ratified by the Senate. It did not fill in numbers, but is actually the law of the land to address it. I might also observe, and I'm sort of getting to your question.
Well, I want to know what you mean by address. Do we know what address means?
Well, no. So that's okay. I'm kind of going there,
okay.
And and then not law of the land, but prior to Kyoto, there was the famous Byrd-Hagel resolution. I think it was 98-0 or something like that, or 99-0, which said before our senior members of the government went to Kyoto, it said you better not come back with an agreement that draws a bright line between the developed and developing countries. Paris answered the mail in both regards. And so Paris should really be welcomed as, in fact, the outcome of 25 years of consideration, especially in the U.S. Senate. Now, so Trump announced that we are to withdraw. I think the most important. Let me say one other thing. In Paris, the Paris Accord was obviously the last day of the meeting by definition, but the first day of the Paris meeting of COP21 was the day on which Mission Innovation was also put forward. and that was 20 countries committing to doubling the innovation budget, and Bill Gates representing 28 investors from 10 countries to say that private capital would kind of work hand in hand with this. So I say that because I believe there are two pillars. One is the Paris Agreement, and the other is a statement, an international statement, that innovation is at the core of climate solutions. Both of those, as you've said in your opening remarks, both of those are under threat, shall we say, both the innovation agenda and, of course, the accord. But to me, the most important conclusion of all of this is we're not going back. The announcements made within days of the president's announcement, mayors and governors, we're not going back. We're going forward. And of course, mayors and governors, especially governors, states, have been in the forefront of a lot of our actions in addressing climate over the last years. Then, and I would argue even more important in the end, I love Jerry Brown and all of his colleagues, but even more important in this context was the well over 1,000 business leaders who also said, we're not going back. They do not have short time horizons. They make big capital allocations, business plan developments, and the like that have to have decadal and even longer implications. And they say, look, okay, we hear you, we're not going back. So I think that's really the important point. We are heading to a low carbon economy, and we need to innovate in technology, in business models, in policy, in regulation, and bring those all together for an accelerated transformation to low carbon. Can I go on?
Keep going.
All right, let's go on. We're going to do my riff then. So in looking at that, how do we, the United States, ultimately the world, but let's say the United States, how do we do our part in that? And we can get into more detail if you wish on any of these aspects. But the two immutable parts of any solution are success on the demand side and decarbonized electricity. You just cannot do it without success in those two arenas, in my view. Then the next statement becomes, okay, if you've decarbonized electricity, then the next thing is electrify as much as you can in the rest of the economy. This is now where, to be honest, we can risk lapsing into being Pollyannish if we think electrification of the entire economy is actually going to get us to very, very deep decarbonization. It's not going to happen in the transportation sector. Writ broadly, sure, light-duty vehicles, we can see that in principle. Buildings are an issue because of the long turnover time. Industry is probably the most challenging of all. And it's because industry is so diverse. It's not like one technology solution for different industries, number one. Secondly, a lot of the energy-intensive industries involve extremely high temperature, process heat. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be electricity. Maybe it's hydrogen. There are other possibilities. But I think we have to look at that, and in looking at that, my physicist back of the envelope arithmetic says we probably need something else too, and that in one way or another is very large-scale carbon management, which can be through engineered solutions, classically engineered solutions. It could be through biological solutions, but we're going to need that. And that's an area where we need some very basic science and probably a long gestation period to get scalability in any solution of that type. So I guess the bottom line to your question is, I would say I have some degree of optimism in the sense that we're not going back, that innovation can really address all these areas I've talked about, but I can't be overly positive in terms of where we stand right now to meet something like a 2-degree goal. It certainly is not beyond the realm of possibility, but it's awfully tough. And if we don't get going a lot faster, the cumulative emissions are just going to make it very, very difficult to meet that goal.
Well, let me put in, this is a good opportunity for me to put a plug in for the regional solutions, which I'll ask you about next. But MIT is hosting a Northeastern US, Eastern Canada summit December 7th and 8th on campus, where Ernie, you'll be speaking, and Michael Bloomberg will be providing the keynote on that, to talk about how we're focusing specifically on the Northeast sector, where the energy challenges of the Northeastern United States and Eastern Canada are very similar, and, and actually Canada has been pretty proactive, particularly Eastern Canada, in terms of clean energy solutions. And so talk to us a little bit about the role of regions. So. Well,
I think it's a very good point, Maria. And in fact, at DOE in these last years, we put a lot of effort into regional solutions. In fact, put out some call for proposals for how regional innovation could best proceed. But I think it's really important to remember that when we talk about low carbon solutions, they're not the same in every country. They're not the same in every region of our country. And so tailoring the innovation agenda to a region's innovation assets, renewable or other sources of energy, challenges, is absolutely critical. And I'll give you an example of where, or a couple of examples where, well, one is real and one is a possibility, where regional assets are specifically used in the context of an economic development plan to attract business. Okay, for example, Iowa. Enormous fraction of, I think the highest fraction of energy in wind. I met with the governor there in 2016, now the ambassador to China, and it was very, very clear. They keep on building more and more wind because it is attracting business that wants to source renewables for their energy. An example, so that's real. And by the way, Kentucky, coal country, is doing the same thing right now with some wind. An example that may never come to pass, but I mentioned earlier the challenge of meeting industrial decarbonization, particularly with energy-intensive industries with high temperature heat requirements. Okay, well, you know, I mentioned hydrogen, that's one possibility. There are others, including, for example, concentrated solar can actually give you very, very high temperatures, but then it will be dismissed. Oh, but you can only do that in, you know, Arizona. Well, maybe Arizona should turn it around and start thinking, maybe that's a way to attract business, right? So I think it's going to need this kind of thinking that brings together these different threads in ways that make sense for economic development as well as meeting the environmental constraints.
Well, there's opportunity here. Wherever there's disruption, there's opportunity. So, you know, I often say someone is going to make money on this. Okay, and
you know, I love quoting the Shell CEO. Says, my job is to make dollars, not barrels. And that's exactly right. So. Provide the energy services that are going to be needed with whatever the boundary conditions are, which in my view are going to include low carbon.
Great. You want to talk to us about the Roosevelt Project, what you're doing here at MIT?
Roosevelt Project, which we're still trying to build up.
Yeah.
Sure. So the Roosevelt Project is, and I can say this, it is funded by the Emerson group, Emerson Collective. The idea is, it follows upon the last question that Maria asked. Well, first of all, one question is which Roosevelt? And the answer is yes. It's Teddy Roosevelt for environmental stewardship, Franklin Roosevelt for kind of a New Deal with jobs, and Eleanor Roosevelt for social justice. So the idea is that we need to take, I think, a much more bottom-up view of localities, communities, maybe regions, in terms of pulling those threads together. Because the reality is the clean energy transformation, especially accelerated, is one of many disruptive elements that are in the society. In fact, I just saw today, near my office, there was a workshop on artificial intelligence and employment. So there are all kinds of technology trends that are disrupting communities, families, et cetera. So the thesis is that ultimately we will probably have the order of 3 case studies that look at different places and really look at what is the right assemblage of, again, innovation assets, educational assets, energy assets, economic opportunities, and really look at what are the tools that can be brought together and tailored to the specific challenges that you see in different communities, different parts of the country. You know, we're still in the building up phase, but it's easy to say, okay, Appalachia is clearly an example. And by the way, one is seeing much more, I think, creativity in these last bit about Appalachia and job growth, et cetera, as energy patterns shift. But you know, there are many other examples. One that I think many would not think of in this category, Melanie probably would, wherever Melanie is, since she's from there. There she is. New Mexico. New Mexico, it's easy to think about New Mexico as, you know, Sandia, Los Alamos, and a lot of oil and gas production, right? And so in New Mexico, there are many people who are clearly not economically challenged, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a state with a dramatic difference or dramatic inequality, and in particular, the Native American populations don't typically share very much in the localized opulence. And then as the energy transformation goes forward, just to give you an example of the thinking, you know, a major revenue source for that state could also be going away. So that's an interesting question. And yet they have such tremendous innovation assets that have not been used effectively. So as effectively as they can be in this context. So for example, the DOE laboratories could, I think, as with other laboratories, play a much more prominent role in regional innovation and development in this way. So that's kind of gives you a flavor, but again, it's a multi-year project, and we're now just building it up.
With this in mind, actually last week, MIT held a conference, the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory and Sloan School did a symposium on AI and the future of work, and there I did another fireside chat with a gentleman named Rusty Justice, who started a software company that employs only former coal miners. Mm-hmm. Okay, and mm-hmm. what he did is he said, all right, coal is going away. And just saying everybody from Eastern Kentucky needs to move is not a solution that's going to work for people. We need good jobs in Eastern Kentucky. And so he thought to himself, software. And he and his partner sat down and made a list of qualities that coal miners have that would translate to the kind of skills that one needed. And these are all people who have not had college degrees, but skills that would be transferable, okay? And the community college didn't offer the kind of coursework that was needed, so they kind of brought some former Kentucky people back made it all content, you know, with people who know the area, know the culture, and developed themselves a 22-week course to train former coal miners, and they had 900 applications for 10 slots. They took 20, and they so the first and it worked because they situated themselves. This is in Pikesville, Kentucky, and it's an old Coca-Cola bottling plant that happened to have fiber run, so that they had broadband. And so just the availability of something like broadband in an area. And so they're a startup, and they're in the process of scaling up, but they did some work for the state of Kentucky. They got some other contracts. They just got a contract from Google. And so it's an example of the thing that you're talking about, the sort of creative work, because now no one can say that you can't teach coal miners to program, right? Because it's happening, and they're good programmers.
And I think the comment you started out with, Maria, is extremely important. Tossing off a solution of, well, everybody should move does not represent the way communities are structured, families are structured. Obviously, it's an important component, but it's just not the solution. And so we need to do this bottom up.
And the training. So when people are laid off from jobs, there's job retraining.
Right.
But then you find out that you can't get a job within 50 miles of your house, and you have a mortgage, and you have children in school, or you have elderly parents, and it gets very complicated. So we really need solutions that work.
And with
locally.
new technology, there's a lot more opportunity for distributed economic activity, something we don't think about in terms of energy, but the energy world, energy technology, but the cross-cutting platforms like additive manufacturing can be enormous game changers in how the society gets organized, et cetera. So this, I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So let's go from local now, and let's talk global. So I spoke relatively recently with one of our local climate skeptics here, and he said to me, Maria, the only thing that the Paris Agreement accomplished was a transfer of wealth. That there was no point in the Paris Agreement. None of the other countries other than the U.S. are serious about taking on this problem. Why bother?
Other than the one country that's wants to withdraw from the Paris Accord,
that's not in the agreement. Yeah. Right. So.
Well, again, I don't buy it. Look, whether or not which countries do and do not meet Paris targets, I'm not prepared to say, of course, right now. I believe it does not change the basic point that essentially every country in the world acknowledged the need to do this, acknowledged the scale that had to be reached. Obviously, there's variation in the commitments and the nature of the commitments, but fundamentally, it was every country in the world coming together with some comparability, I would say, in terms of the nature of the challenge to be met in a relatively short time frame. 2030 for us, 2025, but 2030 is not far away. But of course, that's all. And that's where I go with we're not going back, which is, in my view, the most important outcome of the Paris Accord. But also understanding that those targets themselves are just the first step, because if that's the only step, we know we're not going to be anywhere near reaching the kinds of overall goals that we want for the climate. So. All we can do is keep pushing hard, keep the innovation going to make the transformation as enabled as possible. Cost reduction, for example, in the various technologies, what we've seen with, obviously LEDs, PV, batteries, et cetera, wind. We need a lot more of that. But as I say earlier, we're going to need a lot of innovation as well in the areas of low carbon liquid fuels, of low carbon high temperature process heat. So right now, a lot of the focus tends to be, again, more or less, it tends to be on electricity and efficiency. And that's, as I said earlier, critical, but it's necessary but not sufficient in going forward. But I think the world has really stepped forward. I certainly don't agree with that individual's comment.
Don't shoot the messenger here. This is
no.
But
I said
these are questions.
Right. Yeah.
These are questions that
I mean, but I have to say, to be
addressed.
perfectly honest, that particular statement, I find it difficult to find any merit whatsoever in it. To be perfectly blunt.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So think about your questions. So, think about changes that you've observed in the workforce and the inclusion of women in the energy workforce, and what gains have you seen, and what challenges still need to be overcome?
Well, first of all, I mean, certainly in the energy business that we're talking about here, I think I certainly feel that over the last couple decades, we've seen a lot of progress in the sense of a lot more engagement by women providing, critical expertise and talents to address the problem. If I just go to the DOE, for example, and first I'll start by going back to the second Clinton term when I was undersecretary. This wasn't energy per se; it was the Department of Energy. But I'll always remember Secretary Richardson, Bill Richardson, asking for a roster of people to fill some important slots in the DOE system. And he got his list, and it was 100% men. And he said, go back. Yeah, and initially the statement was, literally, this is 20 years ago, oh, we just don't know of any women qualified for these jobs. Think about it. Oh, turns out it wasn't so hard. There were a whole bunch of women who were perfectly qualified and were appointed, I might say, to those jobs. So similarly, in these last years, I have to say I had exactly the same issue over and over again with advisory committees, and just had to send them back to the offices and say, what the hell, what's going on? And they would come back with outstanding slates, which had a lot of women. So I think that's important, as I said earlier with the ambassadors as well, that we've got to keep pushing this way to make it clear that there are a lot of very successful women in this, major contributions, and they in turn, I think through events like this and through activities like this, can then kind of keep this pipeline opening up in terms of the talents that we need in this field to make the transformations. So I think, and we saw this at this last years. I think we saw this clearly at DOE with many women in all kinds of different ranks throughout the department, making important contributions. So I think that's critical.
Well, one thing that I want to do a shout out to is, while you were secretary, I would visit DOE regularly to basically just to catch up on where things stood with mission innovation, various other things, and so Melanie would put together a group of people to, brief me, and it was full of women. I mean, it was, at least 50-50, if not, many of those discussions were, really dominated by women.
Yeah,
so they're there.
And what I would say is I think it's far less as a construct as opposed to just being opening your eyes and getting the people you need to do the job. So it was great. It just reminded me of a anecdote that's maybe is part of it as well. Going back to the 1980s, when I was director of the Bates Laboratory. Most of you, I'm sure, don't know what the Bates Laboratory is. It's a DOE laboratory that MIT operated for many decades, and I was director, and we actually had a very good mix of women in the graduate student body, and we were trying to recruit a particularly promising woman from Canada to come as a graduate student, and she joined us at lunch. We had informal lunch out at Bates, and she asked one of the then current women graduate students, who's now a faculty member at a major university in the United States, well, you know, from the point of view of being a woman in this kind of environment, you know, why should I come here? And the answer was, well, the director treats everybody equally badly. And so I think that was really part of the key, I think. And she came, and she's also a professor at a major university. So
that's all we want, right? Okay.
Right.
Are there any questions from the audience for Ernie? Back there. I think we.
Thanks a lot for the great discussions. My name is Wei Pan from Harvard University. You talked about the bottom-up approach. I'm just wondering if it is be helpful to have something similar to Paris Accord at sub-national level for the United States, so that we can provide different states and local communities some flexibility, and at the same time having some overarching goal to achieve some overarching goal at the national level.
Well, you know, I think to a large extent we have it. It does not cover the entire. It does not fully tile the United States, but we have many state and regional compacts and approaches, and wait, two points I'll just make. One is, of course, the Clean Power Plan has. This is kind of getting to your question. The Clean Power Plan does not look too healthy at the moment in terms of its coming into force. However, you've probably seen just about all of the projections suggest that even without it, we will more or less meet the goal of the Clean Power Plan, 32% reduction 2030. Of course, in doing so, what it means is that many states will overshoot the Clean Power Plan targets, and a minority of states will come under it. I don't think that is going to benefit that minority of states in the long term to not push in this direction. But that's one thing. Secondly, I would just say that I think there's still remains a lot of creativity, especially at the city and state levels, for continuing on the path to low carbon. And one, we all know many examples. One, more recent one, I'll just point out, is like the California initiative to start having carbon intensity of the supply chain as a parameter in procurements. Because this now becomes a way not only to look at the local targets, if you like, but also to look at carbon leakage across borders. So I think there's a lot happening. I'm actually pretty encouraged at the city and state level.
There certainly are. There are a lot of petitions going around. Probably the most prominent one is Michael Bloomberg's "We're Still In," where various institutions, cities, whatever, can sign up and say we're still going to follow the Paris Accord. So,
yeah.
But I agree, a lot is being done. So here at MIT now, we are doing carbon shadow pricing, and so we are actually, assessing the price of carbon and building that into, all of our infrastructure renovations, et cetera, and also studying how to, apply it more broadly in the campus.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
Okay, are there other questions?
Hi.
Marilyn.
Sorry, I have the microphone, so
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and ask my question. My name's Coralie. I'm from the Fletcher School, and thank you so much for chatting with us. This was asked earlier, but I'm curious about getting your views on it. What do you think is the role of natural gas in a clean energy economy, and what are the dangers of prefacing it as a bridge fuel?
Well, in my view, it is a bridge fuel. I mean, the reality is that we're down. We're not quite halfway, but 12% or something down from 2005, and over half of that, over 60% of that, is from the coal to gas substitution. So the reality is that low-cost gas has driven carbon down. That will continue, in my view, for a while. But of course, eventually, if we are really going to go to so-called deep decarbonization, mid-century and beyond, then natural gas itself, without something like carbon capture, will become too carbon intensive. But I think for the next couple of decades, I think gas is likely to continue to be part of the solution. Now, we do have to obviously worry about the environmental impacts in production, et cetera. We should be lowering methane emissions and all that. But I think that's the case. I might point out, since I may be viewed as unreliable in this answer, that a much more reliable person, President Obama, said exactly the same thing on the South Lawn of the White House in October of 2016 with Leo DiCaprio. And he, and the reality is that it's lowered carbon emissions. It has led to a lot of job creation. It has led to probably the order of $200 billion of investment in new manufacturing capability. And so, to me, to President Obama, and I would agree, the answer has to be we've got to continue to take advantage of this, at least again for quite a while we work hard on minimizing the environmental footprint questions.
Great. Okay, another question. How about right here?
Marilyn Brown, we really appreciate it.
I know.
I'll try to throw you a softball, but we really appreciated the participation and active support you've had for C3E and Melanie as well. Above and beyond Call of Duty, year after year. I wish you had seen some of the earlier panels today, the young entrepreneurs and bureaucrats and researchers out there in universities doing just great things. I'm wondering if you might be willing to offer us some advice as an organization going forward. It seems from my very informal polling that there's not a particularly proportionate assignment of senior positions to women these days. Little bit of, what I see, a little bit of backpedaling on some of the progress that we've made in the Department of Energy and other agencies. So we have a different kind of environment. Is it truly less welcoming, or is it just my naive, outside looking in view? And whatever the answer to that, can you give us some advice on how we can make the most of this opportunity to help women in their science careers in energy?
Buy low, sell high. Look, just like with climate, there are bumps in the road, but I think there's no substitute for just continuing well, first of all, continuing to make the contributions that you are making, and you've been making them for how many decades now, Marilyn? I'm just returning your question. That's right. But I think the events like this, but more importantly, even the messages that go out from here are what's important. And I think it's like the Paris Accord and the president's announcement. We're not going back, right? But doesn't mean there aren't bumps and detours in the road. I do think a piece of advice, which is not part of your question, but I do think that it would be very helpful, and obviously I understand the challenges, but be very helpful to really continue and build the internationalization of C3E. I think that's really important to do. There are lots of other countries that are, kind of all in, but there are lots of other countries that are not. And I think it's, it's not going to be a one-year job, but I think that's really important to do. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take one more question. How about right there?
Hi. So clearly we know that we've reached this point because of anthropogenic activities, and yet we're still, I don't think we've actually shifted how we do things, because all I'm hearing really is like we're still talking about economic development. No one wants to go back or anything, but it's that same economic development that has gotten us here in this particular situation. And so I'm just wondering, is there something that we can do regarding policy or something regarding, like, say, externalities? Because until we have like this closed loop, economy, we're still going to be doing the same thing. Like, the same thing is just going to keep happening. The people who are making these problems are not being held accountable for. So, like, we can try and do, like, alternative this, that, or the other, but like the same mentality is still there in terms of economic development, in terms of, excuse me, in terms of the, viewing certain externalities as external costs. Like, until that becomes part of the, production or a production cost, we're fighting like a losing battle, I think. Any thoughts on that?
Well, again, first of all, it is a fact that we have reduced if we use greenhouse gas emissions as the metric, we certainly have reduced them substantially. We have greatly increased energy productivity, energy per unit of GDP, let's say. So I think there is real progress, but in terms of phrasing it with your question in terms of externalities, the big externality of CO2 emissions is not being priced. So ultimately, I think we have to put a price on carbon, and I think it will happen. I think it will happen in the not so distant future. How it is implemented is important. I happen to think that there's a lot of attraction, not the only approach, but the so-called conservatives approach, which is George Shultz and Jim Baker and et cetera, as one approach where they say, okay, first put a stiff price on carbon. They talk north of $40 a ton. Secondly, return the revenue completely back to the people uniformly. Don't let Congress get its hands on the money, roughly speaking. And that is progressive. The estimates are that about 70%, the lowest 70% of the income distribution would come out net positive on that. So it's got a progressive aspect. And third, in doing so, simultaneously remove some undetermined set of regulations and financial incentives. It's a package that has something to appeal to all parts of the political spectrum. I'm not saying it is the answer in the end, but that's an example of trying to construct something that does your job of the externality, in this case of carbon emissions coming in. And within those ground rules, then people will look at and companies and others will be looking at how they maximize economic development while being incentivized away from greenhouse gas emissions.
Great. Okay. Well, it's the witching hour. So,
Okay.
Ernie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Pleasure.
We're good? Good.
Okay, everybody. So it's been a great day, and we're looking forward to the networking dinners. Those of you who have signed up have on the back of your name tag the restaurant where you're going to be heading. And so what we ask you to do is, in the next few minutes, by 7 o'clock, to be down on the first floor with your coat and everything else you need. Don't leave anything here. And there'll be guides to take you to the various different locations. And they're all going to be great restaurants, and we'll see you tomorrow morning bright and early after the dinners. And your sleep. Goodbye.